here today with Michigan's longest-serving U.S. Senator and chair of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School, Senator Carl Levin. I'm Linda Gustitis, and I am currently serving as one of the co-directors for the Levin Center. I worked for Senator Levin as the staff director of his various subcommittees in the Senate for 24 years. Senator Levin, you did congressional oversight for 36 years. That has to be one of, if not the longest record in the Senate, I imagine. And you are well known for doing it well and right. So today, let's talk about what it is that it takes to do good congressional oversight. And I'd like to start with how you decide what to spend your time on. What do you investigate? How do you know what to do?
Well, there's a lot of sources that come to your attention. One is that the problem is brought to you by constituents who say that there's a huge issue with some federal agency not doing what they should do, or some large entity in our town or state that is doing things that they shouldn't do. It could be a private, commercial entity. Or it could come from the media. The media could cover a real problem. They could do the digging. The original investigations could be done by reporters, investigative reporters sometime. So there's many ways it could come actually through the mail. Someone could drop off something anonymously. It could come from it being the problem that you want to address could come from a report of a inspector general, or it could come from some investigation in some other committee of Congress. Or there's many sources that could bring to your attention in a dramatic way a real problem that needs attention.
So how do you decide whether to go forward with an investigation? What would you, once you've identified an issue, what's the next step?
I think the first thing you need to do is to see, is it probably a major problem? If it's just a problem that faces one person or 10 or 20 or 30 people who aren't being served well, for instance, by an agency, then you want to just take up their problems with the agency. That's kind of called constituent service, where we have constituents who, for instance, haven't been dealt with properly by the IRS or by the VA. But if that becomes something larger than a few people, if you find out that it's the VA that has a problem with a long waiting list, for instance, of veterans who aren't being tended to properly, at that point you want to start digging into the VA as a more generic problem, and you start asking questions that would affect, the answers to which might affect hundreds or even thousands of people.
So what do you ask your staff to do right off the bat? I take it you don't do the initial investigation yourself. You have staff to do that. So what do you direct them to do? What do they start with?
If it's kind of one or two or three people that have a problem, for instance, with an agency, then I would give it to the part of the staff that would call the agency and say, hey, we have a constituent here who hasn't been served properly by you, and we want you to get on with it already and to provide the service that we intend. So that could be done without me knowing anything about it. But my staff might come to me and tell me, we've gotten dozens or hundreds of letters or emails or calls from people about a particular agency not performing its function. We've done some checking. We've called some other offices, maybe your colleague in the Senate, or maybe some of your colleagues in the House of Representatives, to see have they had a similar experience. And you know, there's an endemic problem here. There's an across-the-board problem here with this agency, and it involves literally hundreds and hundreds of people. So then I would probably tell a different staff. It could be on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, for instance, which you were chief of staff on for so many years with such brilliance, and to ask you and the staff at the Permanent Subcommittee dig deeper here. Find out the extent of this problem. If, for instance, if a whistleblower had been the one who came into the office, that could trigger a much more deeper investigation to see if there is something that is kind of fundamentally wrong going on. And then the staff on, for instance, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, so it could be my Armed Services Committee staff, would start having a broader inquiry, would start bringing in people who could give us information, give us facts about the extent of a problem. If there's a big, for instance, if a contract for a airplane is way over the amount of money that was supposed to be spent, I'd get my Armed Services staff to start digging in what's going on here. Why is this cost of this plane coming in at 20% more than the contract calls for? So staff then starts digging, and if they find that there's a real problem here that needs some push at a higher level or at a more visible level, or more in depth, which might require 2 or 3 staff people getting involved, perhaps looking at hundreds of thousands of documents.
Yes.
In case of some of our investigations, millions of documents. Yeah. At that point, you need to make a decision. Well, I have a very relatively small staff, at least on the permanent subcommittee. I only have 3 or 4 or 5 staffers. Do I want to tell the staffers, hey, put this now on your list, that's the next thing? And if it's something really urgent, you may have to set aside the work that you're doing to immediately take on a problem and to see if we can't solve it short of a more in-depth investigation.
I remember when we worked on sweepstakes together, that kind of started when I talked to you about my father getting all of these sweepstakes solicitations. And he was spending money to buy little tchotchkes and newspapers and magazine subscriptions. And he was losing money by doing that with the expectation that he was going to win the sweepstakes, $1 million. And you encouraged me to look into it, and it's very much what you said. It turned out that the post office said it was one of the biggest mail fraud practices going on in the country. AARP chimed in and said it was one of the biggest things that they complained about. So from that, we built up a major investigation into sweepstakes and learned that it wasn't just a small problem, it was a very big problem.
Involving millions of usually senior citizens, all of whom thought that Ed McMahon was going to show up on their doorstep the next day.
And they targeted the senior citizens. Yeah. I mean, then when we got into the documents, we learned that in fact, these sweepstakes companies had psychological designs on the senior citizens who were vulnerable and lonely and were using that to
sell magazines.
And make money for it. Well, how do you involve, so say you've got this issue now and it's really going well and you think it's really meaningful. You're the chair, but you also have a ranking member. You have other members of your committee. To what extent do you involve them in your investigation?
Well, I learned early, and the staff reinforced that constantly, that the most effective way you can do oversight in terms of having an impact on policy, as we did in the sweepstakes, where we actually got a reform law passed to reform the way in which these sweepstakes would represent things to people. If you want to have an impact on policy, it's got to be in-depth investigation. You can't just look at a headline or take one whistleblower's word for something. You've got to be in-depth. It's got to also be bipartisan. And this gets to the question that you ask, because you have colleagues. And it's critically important that these investigations, if they're going to have a legislative effect, in other words, have an impact on the law, you've got to work on a bipartisan basis. Otherwise, it won't happen. If it's a partisan investigation, like so many of the current House of Representative Republican investigations are, like the one that's on the IRS or the one that was on Benghazi. These were highly partisan investigations that where the Democrats were not only left out, but the Democrats were put in the position of then saying, hey, we want you to call certain other witnesses. That was refused, and so they made enemies out of potential supporters. There's no reason why any subject of importance cannot be looked at on a bipartisan basis, even if the recommendations that come from the investigation may be different because of different philosophical perspectives. The facts are the facts, and they ought to be gone after by the staffs, Democratic, Republican staffs, working hand in hand.
So how did you accomplish that? How did you engage or involve the other side in your investigations? Were they allowed to ask questions and seek documents and participate fully in the investigation?
And more so. They not only did we encourage them to have their staffs work with our staffs together. For instance, every interview of a witness, they would both staffs would be there, Democratic, Republican. Preparation for an interview, they would share notes. After an interview, they would share their observations, drafting reports, drafting requests, all done together. And it works beautifully when that is the case. It's not always the case, I'm afraid, on a number of other committees, because you sometimes have staffs at loggerheads. But leadership is critically important. The most single important thing you can do before proceeding is to sit down with your Republican, in my case, my Republican counterparts. If it's a Republican chairman, then with their Democratic counterparts. Sit down with the other party, the leaders of the other party on the committee, and say, this is what we think we've got here. There's a real problem. We'd like to dig deeper, and we'd like our staffs, as always, to work together. What do you think? Because you want to get a buy-in. You want to make sure that the other party's leaders on the committee also feel that it's a problem and that it's not being used for partisan purposes. And usually that works out. So that's number one, is you got to include the other party on the takeoff if you want them to be there on the landing, as we say. Secondly, the way in which the rules of our subcommittee, of that particular permanent
subcommittee on investigations,
protect the minority. The rules themselves protect the minority by giving the minority the power to initiate an inquiry in the name of the committee. Now, it's not the same as launching an investigation in the name of the subcommittee. It's not quite the same, because an investigation is more formal. It implies that there's subpoena power, which the chairman can issue on his own or on her own.
For that subcommittee.
Just on that subcommittee, but there's a balance on that subcommittee so that the minority can force the vote on the subpoena to go to the full committee. It never happened in my 10 years, I guess, as chairman, roughly, because there was such trust, such confidence, such sharing of power that if the minority wanted a subpoena, I can't remember any instance where I would not agree to it. There may have been, and we may have talked it over, but I can't remember one. So I probably issued hundreds of subpoenas and probably authorized for the minority maybe dozens, or I don't know how many.
You authorized their subpoenas.
Right, and signed subpoenas. Signed their subpoenas, because the chairman's got to sign it, but signed the subpoenas that they requested. And so the rules themselves in this subcommittee do what I'm not sure any other subcommittee does, which is to give the minority the right in their own name, even if they can't get agreement from the majority, gives the minority the right to initiate an inquiry. Those are the words of the rules, and that means on the letterhead of the subcommittee.
It is the subcommittee, yeah. It has the imprimatur of the subcommittee.
Exactly. The letter can go out to whoever the party is that is being asked the questions. We are looking into such and such a matter. And we're asking that you provide the following information. That letter would be signed, if it's a minority inquiry, by the ranking minority member.
So a lot of that then involves trust. You're trusting the other party to play fairly and with you, because you're playing fairly with them. Has that worked out for you? Has that been a good experience in terms of the confidence and trust that you've had in the opposing party?
It's always been the case, with no exception. There have been a couple cases where we just had differences, but they were always done in an open way, in an honest way. There was even one case, fairly near the end of my years in the Senate, where I had a disagreement with my ranking Republican, and we just agreed on a process that would not open up wounds and scars of a partisan nature. We found a way to issue a report. Each of us had a separate report, but we decided we would not have a hearing because the hearing could not accomplish anything. It was too highly partisan an issue, made partisan by the House, but nonetheless it was so partisan that we could not have succeeded in having a bipartisan hearing. And we didn't want to do that.
So the two of you decided not to hold the hearing?
Just simply to do it with separate reports, issue the reports, make them public, but not to have a hearing which would be worse than useless. It'd be useless because it wouldn't contribute to anything if you just have folks just lobbing grenades at each other, which this is such an explosive issue and such a difference of opinion between Democrats and Republicans. And it was so politicized over in the House, there was no way that we could have had the kind of hearing which would be productive, which is to dig into something to get the facts. And so long as that's the focus of both parties, let's get the facts. Don't prejudge, don't assume, don't make charges, don't leak documents. Let's handle this thing together, even if we might reach different conclusions. The process has got to be a joint arm-in-arm process.
Thank you for your time today, Senator Levin. And we'll talk more about the elements of oversight in part 2 of our discussion.